Good morning, friends. So today we are going to have a talk by Dr. Reba, slightly different kind of a study design. Latent class is Reba will explain the concepts. I won't spoil the fun, but it's looking for hidden meanings in larger data. So that's not a new concept. It's been around for a long time, but for us in CEU, it's a topic which we haven't explored for a while. So, with that little teaser, I'll hand over to Reba. She's taken a lot of effort, so I'm sure you're in for a Saturday feast.
Thank you, sir. Welcome everyone for today's talk in short course in clinical epidemiology. I'll be talking about understanding and appraising a latent class analysis in a cross-sectional study. So let's start off with a case scenario. You're an intern sitting in a busy medicine OPD. Within the first 1 hour, 3 patients complain of gas. So the first patient is a 32-year-old school teacher. She says, I feel my stomach is full of gas even without eating much. She appears anxious, and on probing, you find that she is very stressed. Then we have a 60-year-old retired banker who complains of severe bloating daily, worse by evening, and he passes stools only once in 3 to 4 days. And a third case is a 28-year-old IT professional, and he complains that every time he eats rajma or dosa or chutney, he gets severe bloating and gas within 1 to 2 hours. So you gave all 3 patients the same medication. So as an intern, what medication did you give him? Yeah, so all of us gave Pantop and Simethicone. But are all the bloaters and distenders, are they the same? Can we give one same treatment for all the 3 patients? So let's explore. So Rome 4 is the latest guidelines which actually defines functional bowel disease. Okay, so what they've previously labeled as functional gastrointestinal disorders has a new terminology. It's called disorders of gut and brain interaction. That means there are some GI problems where the problem is either in the brain or the problem is in your gut. Okay, so it's characterized by motility disturbance, visceral hypersensitivity. That means the patient has more pain. There is some problem in the mucus or immune function. There's alteration in the gut microbiota, and there is some problem with the CNS system. So if you look at the Rome 4 classification, they have diagnosed this based on, they've grouped them based on the anatomy. So problems which can involve the brain, problems in the esophagus, like for example, functional chest pain, functional heartburn. There can be problems in the gastroduodenal area. For example, your belching disorders, your nausea and vomiting disorders. There can be problems in the gallbladder area, problems in the anorectal disorder area. For example, fecal incontinence and functional anorectal pain. There can be bowel problems, your irritable bowel syndrome, which has 4 categories. It can be irritable bowel syndrome with constipation, irritable bowel syndrome with diarrhea, irritable bowel syndrome with mixed bowel habits, or functional constipation, functional diarrhea. Now, what are the common symptoms of this gut-brain interaction disorders? Most of the patients complaining of bloating and distension, they complain of excessive gas, they can have diarrhea, constipation, nausea, abdominal pain, fatigue, anxiety, poor sleep, heartburn and reflux. So if you look at how the Rome 4 used to, how the Rome used to classify these disorders, in the Rome 1 model, they said all these 4 disorders are distinct. Then subsequently in Rome 2 and Rome 3, they said all these models have an overlap. And currently the Rome 4 guidelines say that all these models are a continuum. So you can either be in the constipation spectrum or you can be in the diarrhea spectrum. You can have no pain or you can have a lot of pain. And if you have a lot of pain, it's called IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. You can have either bloating or distension. So what's abdominal bloating? It's when you have a subjective feeling that you have gas in your stomach and you have the sense of fullness, you have a sense of abdominal pressure. And what is abdominal distension? The patient actually has a visible increase in the abdominal girth. So if you see, the prevalence in the general population itself is 30%. And especially patients who have these disorders of gut and bowel interaction, the prevalence is almost 96%. So, so a group of people had this doubt. Are all the bloaters and distenders, are they the same? Is there anything different in the dietary habit? Is there anything different in the physical activity? Is there anything different in their psychosocial well-being? Do they have any different comorbidities? Now, to answer these questions, this study was done. It's called bloating and distension patients from 6 distinct latent clusters based on symptoms, diet, psychosocial, and quality of life parameters. So this came out in March 2026. So they basically used one statistical model called latent class analysis to define 6 clusters of population. So for the rest of my talk, I'll be giving an overview, introduction to latent class analysis, and I'll also be doing a critical appraisal of this particular study. So let's start off. So it's a warm Saturday afternoon. A group of people are having barbecue lunch. Suddenly, a woman collapses. So some people run to help her. Some start to do CPR. Some people stand around frightened, not knowing what to do. Some start to cry and panic. Some are calm and call the ambulance. And once the paramedics arrive, they calmly relate the event. Now, why are all these people responding differently? Can you guess? Is there something among these people which makes them respond differently? Some people are confident in managing this patient. Some people are terrified. Okay. Yes. Okay, one is different personalities. Yes. So if I'll show you the next slide. Who are these? So some of them are actually doctors. In that entire, among the people who came for barbecue, there was one class of doctors, and that's why they were very confident in dealing with that collapsed patient. Now, looking at this picture, what made you say that they were doctors? So you saw some indicators which are categorical. For example, were they wearing scrubs? Did they have a stethoscope? Did they have an ID badge? And if you talk to them whether they're working night shifts, do they use medical jargon? And what is the workplace type? Do they work in a hospital? And what is their dress style? Are they dressed formally or casually? So these are indicators which are categorical. In terms, they're either yes or no, or you give them a class, like for example, hospital, or like a formal attire. You can also get indicators which are continuous. For example, if you ask how many hours they work per week, what was their average income, what was the years of training, the number of certifications, all these are numbers. So these are continuous variables. Okay. To further actually explain to you what is hidden variable, I'll just give you an excerpt from a book which I really loved when I was small. It's called The Little Prince. It's basically a small prince falls from a different planet, he comes to Earth. So I'll just read a narrative from this book. Once when I was 6 years old, I saw a magnificent picture in a book called True Stories from Nature about the primeval forest. It was a picture of a boa constrictor in the act of swallowing an animal. Here is a copy of the drawing. In the book, it said, boa constrictors swallow their prey whole without chewing it. After that, they're not able to move, and they sleep through the 6 months that they need for digestion. I pondered deeply then over the adventures of the jungle. And after some work with a colored pencil, I succeeded in making my first drawing. My drawing number 1, it looks something like this. What does this look like? Okay, so I showed my masterpiece to the grown-ups and asked them whether the drawing frightened them. But they answered, frightened? Why should anyone be frightened by a hat? My drawing was not a picture of a hat. It was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. But since the grown-ups were not able to understand it, I made another drawing. I drew the inside of a boa constrictor so that the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always need to have things explained. My drawing number 2 looked like this. So here, you have an observation. Something looks like a hat. But what was the cause of that observation? It was an elephant which was hidden. So that is a latent variable. So from outside, all we see is a hat, but that shape is actually generated by something hidden. In the first example, we all know that there is a class called doctors. Okay, we all know how doctors look and how they act. But in this second example, you have no idea what this class itself is unless you actually cross-check that diagram. So I'll give you another example to illustrate this. Suppose I plot all the heights of people in a class. What does the shape look like? Normally, if you plot everything, we have a Gaussian shape, right? We have a bell-shaped curve. But here you can see 2 peaks. Why is it that? On the y-axis, you have the number of people, and on the x-axis, you have height. Yes. So over here, if you see, the hidden variable is gender. So in a population of students, you have males and you have females. So the female average contributes to the first peak, and the male average contributes to the second peak. So whenever you look at a population, all you see is this. You see a huge population, but actually within a population, you have different classes, and all these classes are divided by a latent variable. And what we can see is only the blue, but in reality, there is so many things going on which we cannot see. Okay, so how do we actually identify this latent variable? One is by looking at the categorical variables. One is by looking at the continuous variables. If you use the categorical variable approach, it's called the latent class analysis. But on the other hand, if you're looking at numbers to identify the latent variable, it's called a latent profile analysis. Now, all this is assuming that your latent variable itself is a class. Now, what if your latent variable is continuous? You use something called factor analysis. So when you read the literature regarding this latent analysis, you might come across a term called finite mixture modeling. So what is this? This is basically a statistical modeling that is used to identify latent groupings within a data set. And this is a huge umbrella term under which you have latent class analysis, latent profile analysis, growth mixture models, as well as latent transition analysis. So the basic fundamental steps are you collect observational data and you have to assume that a population has a certain amount of hidden groups. And then you check each individual, how do they fit into that group? And you give them 80% probability of fitting into cluster 1, 15% probability of fitting into cluster 2, 5% probability of fitting into cluster 3. And then you define the group characteristics. So this slide is basically the conceptual foundation of the latent class model. So your first step is having a latent variable. So latent variable is error-free and we have no idea what it is. What we can see is observed variables, and these give us a clue on what the latent variable is. Now, the problem with observed variable is they're actually prone for error. So they're prone for measurement error, etc. But the underlying latent variable is not prone to error. The next thing I want you to observe is, if you look at the direction of the arrows, what you see is the latent variable causes your observed variable. It's not the other way around. You can use this variable to understand the latent variable, but the observed variable does not cause the latent variable. And likewise, the errors also contribute to what you're actually seeing. Now in sociology, they use these observed variables are called indicators, and this latent variable, it's called construct in the sociology discipline. Now for the rest of the class, there are some examples which I have taken from this book called Latent Class Analysis by Dr. Stephanie Lanza, and some online material by her, which is available in the Statistical Horizon page. And the book is actually here in our CEO, so you can read it if you're interested. So an example, okay? So how they've used latent classes to define adolescent drinking behavior. So they've taken data from the 2004 cohort called the Monitoring the Future public release. So they have taken 12th grade students. The total number was 2,590 high school seniors. And the goals of the study was to look at the alcohol use behavior. Now to identify this, they have used 7 indicators. These are your observed variable, and they've seen what proportion those students have said yes. So look at the variables they've taken. They've looked at lifetime alcohol use, whether they've drank alcohol in the past year, whether they have drank alcohol in the past month. They've looked at lifetime drunkenness, past year drunkenness, past month drunkenness, and also if they've drunk more than 5 drinks in the past 2 weeks. So if you look at the variables, they're quite multidimensional. They're not just looking at the severity of your alcohol use, they're also looking at the recency of your alcohol use. Are you a past alcohol use, like a reformed alcohol use, or are you a ongoing alcohol use? So this is a multidimensionality in the variables they've chosen. Now looking at this data, can you identify any subgroups that engage in particular patterns of drinking? And if so, what was the distribution across these subgroups? By just looking at this data, we can't really make that inference. So to understand the behavior pattern, first is not just looking at the individual variable, you must also see the relation among the variables. So the starting point of this is actually to create a contingency table. That is cross-tabulation of 7 variables. So how many questions were there in the previous slide? 7 questions. So these are 7 indicator variables. And what are the possible responses that you could have for each question? Yes or no. So totally how many responses can you have? You can have 2 to the power 7 responses, which is about 128 cells. Okay, so if you code yes as 1 and no as 0, I'll just show you how a contingency table looks. Suppose I was a first patient, I could answer yes for the first question, no for the rest of the question. Somebody else can answer yes for the first 2 questions and no for the rest of the questions. So like this, if you start creating a table, you'll have totally how many cells? 128 cells, and you'll have different frequency of people answering yes to the same response. Okay. But do you notice something here in this data? You have an incomplete response. So it's very common in your data set. You'll always have people who do not answer a question. Either they don't want to answer a question, or by oversight, they might have missed the question. So all this will add complexity to the final data when you're analyzing it. Now, just for understanding purpose, I have taken only 3 of those variables and I have created my own small contingency table. So if I have 3 variables, how many cells will be there in my contingency table? About 8, because 3 variables, each of them can say yes or no. So totally I'll have 8 response patterns. So let's look. The first response pattern says yes for past month alcohol, past month drunkenness, and 5+ drinks for recent in 2 weeks. Now, I'll just give you 1 minute to look at this data, and you can infer something from this data. And you can also look if there's a pattern of response which occurs more frequently than the others. Okay, which pattern is the most frequent? Yes, so not drinking is the most frequent. Okay, and if you look at one, okay, I think this thing alignment has changed. But if you look at the second last 3 rows, this pattern does not make sense. For example, the student has said, I don't drink alcohol in the past month, but he said yes for past month drunkenness. And he's also said yes for more than 5 drinks per month. So can you see there is an error in this data set? And actually 3 columns have error. And you can also see that the first 2 columns, they have mentioned that their past month alcohol drinkers, they were drunk and they had more than 5+ drinks. So we know that this group is actually a severe alcohol use disorder. We know the middle group is a moderate alcohol or a light drinker. And we know that we have an abstinent group also. Now, it is very easy for us because there were only 8 cells. But is it possible to make such an inference if you have so many cells, like 128 cells and 500 cells? It's impossible. That is why we need to do an LCA. It basically represents a huge array of data in a format which is easier to represent and understand, and it breaks it down into clusters. So this is one application of an LCA. Now, second thing is, we saw that among the 8 tables itself, there was so much of error, right? So what do you think will be the error if you had some 128 cells or 500 cells? So much. And it's not possible for the human unaided brain to actually make such inferences. So that is why it helps to discern meaningful, scientifically interesting classes against a noisy background of error. Okay. So now the authors have applied LCA to this data. How they apply LCA, I'll come back to it later. Now let's just say that they have applied the model and they have identified 5 classes. Okay. And when you look at the LCA output, there are 2 outputs. The first is the latent class prevalence. That means now the entire population is divided into 5 classes. And they have given the size of each class. Which class is the maximum here? So class 5 has 34% probability. And if you look at vertically, they have given you something called a item response probability. That means, suppose I belong to class 1, what is the probability that I will say yes to lifetime alcohol use? It's 0. But suppose I was class 5, what is the probability that I will say yes to lifetime alcohol use? It's 100%. So this entire, so all these parameters, they're all conditional probabilities. They're all telling you what is the chance that you will say yes to an indicator based on what class you belong to. Okay, so this is very important that you understand this term called item response probability. Any doubts so far? Okay, so the next thing I want to tell you is, when you add the prevalence of each of the 4 classes, it should be 100%. Okay, so the main concept is latent classes are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So none of the clusters actually overlap. All of the clusters are distinct. So no one belongs to more than 2 latent classes. So the sum will never exceed 100%, and everyone is classified. Nobody is missed. So the sum can never be less than 100%. Okay, so what they've done is, anyone who has said a probability of more than 50%, they have given ticks. So you have class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, class 5. Now looking at this pattern, can you label the classes? Because finally your output is going to give you classes. It's up to the clinician to actually make sense of the classes and decide what these classes are. So what is class 1? These are non-drinkers. They never drink. Let's go to an easier class. What is this? They're heavy alcohol use. What about these? They had used alcohol in the past, but they're no more drinking. These are reformed. And what is this? Yeah. So how they have labeled as one is light drinkers, and they have also labeled somebody as past partiers. In the sense, they have been drunk in the past, they have used alcohol in the past, but they have reformed. Okay. Okay. So now when we talk about these item response probabilities, they're basically telling you how strong is the relation between the observed variable and the latent variable, that is the class. Okay, so the first way to say if it's a strong correlation or not is, for a particular class, the probability of you drinking lifetime drunk is different from what you would, the answers from different classes. Okay, so for example, what is the answer for lifetime drunkenness if you belong to class 1? 0%. If you belong to class 2, it's 24%. If you belong to class 5, it's about 1%. Okay, so that is one way to say the strength. Suppose for this particular question, for past year drunkenness, if everybody says 0, okay, for past month drunkenness, if everybody says 0, what inference can you make? Then what you can understand is there is no correlation between your variable and your observed variable and your latent variable. Whether you belong to any class, it does not make any difference. The answer is always going to be 0. Okay. So to understand this, we actually look at the conditional probability formula. So what is the probability of A given that you belong to a probability B? Like what is the probability of A given that you belong to a class B? Is basically the probability of A and B divided by probability of B. And if your probability, and if your A and B are independent events, then this overall probability is equal to probability of A. I'll just give you an example. Suppose you have a box of dice. You have a red die and a blue die. And all the dice are fair. So if I want to roll 2, what is the probability of me rolling 2? It'll be 1 by 6. Whether I take the red die or the blue die, it makes no difference. That means the color is independent from my the 1 by 3. And if I use a red die, it's 1 by 6. Does it make a difference whether I roll a red die or a blue die? Yes. So if I picked up the red dice, my probability is 1 by 2 into 1 by 6. 1 by 2 is because I can either pick blue or a red die. Then after picking the die of me rolling 6 is 1 by 6. So here the probability will be 1 by 12. But on the other hand, if I pick the blue dice, my probability will be 1 by 2 into 1 by 3. Okay, so if your variables are dependent, they're all different based on the classes. The next way to say whether these item probabilities are strong or not is to look at the numbers. The closer it is to 0 or the closer it is to 1 means it's a stronger relation. Okay, so the next concept is homogeneity and latent class separation. So what this tells you is within the class, all the individuals should have the same response. That means they have a high within class homogeneity, but they should be very different from different latent classes. That means between the classes, they should be heterogeneous. Okay, so I will give an example of this. So let's look at some questions are there, okay, about smoking. So these are indicators. Smoke first thing in the morning. They purchase a pack for their own use, and they go 3 days without smoking. Each of these indicators have their own responses. They can always smoke. They can sometimes smoke first thing in the morning, and they can never smoke. Now, if you look at regular smokers, what is the probability that they will always smoke first thing in the morning? 90%. And what is the chance that they're going to say sometimes or never? It's very, very low. So everybody in this group, 90% of them will say they're going to smoke. So high degree of homogeneity means for each latent class, for a particular variable, there is always a clear response. Okay. So for regular smokers, are always going to say, always smoke first thing in the morning. They will always purchase the first pack for their own use. And they will say never for going 3 days without smoking. Now, low level of smokers will say, sometimes only they smoke first thing in the morning. and always they purchase pack for their own use, and sometimes they go 3 days without smoking. Light intermittent smokers will say they never smoke first thing in the morning, they never purchase their own pack for their use, and they can always go 3 days without smoking. So we're basically looking at a particular indicator, and we're looking at the response pattern for that particular indicator. Now, what is latent class separation? Latent class separation means two classes will never have the same response. So for example, regular smokers will always say always, always, and never. Low-level smokers will say sometimes, always, and sometimes. And light intermittent smokers will always say never, never, always. So the pattern among these classes are different. That is called latent class separation. So if you want to do it graphically, these are high levels of smokers. You can see the pattern is very different from intermediate smokers. This is very different from low-level smokers. And you can also see that the responses are very far apart. It's closer to 1 and it's closer to 0 on this side. So this means there's high homogeneity and high latent class separation. Now suppose the same data, you have different classes. You have regular smokers 1, regular smokers 2, and you have light intermittent smokers. So for this particular class, what is the chance that they're going to smoke first thing in the morning? 90%. What about regular smokers 2? They're 80%. And light intermittent smokers are 5%. So here what you can see is they're homogeneous. Okay, the values are close to 1 and close to 0, but there is no clear latent class separation. The first two classes are almost similar. They have the same pattern. Then the third example is, look at the values here. What is the item probability that you're going to respond always if you belong to latent class 1? 40%. And in latent class 2 is 30%. So here you can see that there is no good class distinction. And even within the latent class itself, there is no clear response which is going to be probable. That means this is a heterogeneous population. And if you look at the graph, you can see that they're not separated and the patterns are also looking similar. So when you talk about item response probability, you make two inferences. You can talk about the homogeneity. You can also talk about the latent class separation. And one thing to remember is a high degree of latent class separation means that the population has high homogeneity. And just because they have high degree of homogeneity does not mean that they have a high degree of latent class separation. Okay, so far we have been looking at the probability of an observation based on the latent class. Now the next step to understand is, what is the probability of you belonging to a class based on your response pattern? So this is also called the posterior probability. And that is actually the final precision of your model. That means what is the chance that you belong to a particular class based on your response pattern? Okay, so this basically reflects the person orientation which is inherent in LCA. And it enables the investigator to consider each individual's likely latent class membership given his or her observed response pattern. So if you finally look at the output of the model will tell me patient 1 has 85% chance of belonging to class 1. Patient 2 has 70% chance of belonging to class 2. So if you have high homogeneity and high latent class separation, your posterior probability also will be high for a particular class. So what you need to understand is, latent model is never going to tell you which individual belongs to which class. It has no idea. What it will tell you is what is the probability that you probably belong to a particular class. And it runs on the Bayes theorem. So every model will have some sort of uncertainty. So how do you measure the uncertainty? One is by using something called mean posterior probability. And one another important thing is the word entropy. If it's closer to 1, that means there's better separation. If it's 0, that means there is very poor separation. And we want the entropy in our models to be close to 1. And there's another concept called odds of correct classification. There's one more concept in latent class, which is the principle of local independence. That means each of the variables are not dependent on each other. They're only dependent on the latent variable. And if this assumption is broken, it's called violation of the principle of local independence. So I'll give you example of what it means. Sometimes, suppose you want to study a cluster of low mood, fatigue, sleep disturbance, and appetite change. And you have two classes. Class 1 belongs to mild depression. Class 2 is severe depression. So what LCA assumes is fatigue and sleep disturbance are independent given the class. Meaning a patient can have fatigue, patient can have sleep problem, because they belong to the depressed category. Is that true in real life? Yeah, if you're depressed, you will have fatigue and you will have decreased sleep. But it's also true, if I'm not depressed, if I don't sleep well the previous night, the next day morning, I'm going to have fatigue. So that means there is a violation of the rule. Okay, so actually these two variables are actually related to each other. So when you design a model, you should be careful when you choose variables that they don't have intrinsic relation to each other. The only way variables should be related is because of the latent class. Otherwise, what will happen is when you run the model, you'll have more and more classes which are being formed. Okay, so we'll just have a small refresher. We've looked at the concepts of parameters. What are the two parameters our latent class analysis produces? First is the class prevalence. Second is it tells you the item response probability. That means what is the probability that you will get a response based on your class. The second thing we looked at was homogeneity and latent class separation. We looked at precision. We looked at local independence. The next thing that we talked about was that true class membership is never known. And latent classes are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. And the goal of this LCA is to determine how many subgroups can you generate to describe the entire population. You might describe the entire population with 3 subgroups, or you might require 7 subgroups to describe an entire population. So now we'll go to a little bit more slightly technical aspects of LCA. So if you look at this, we have mannequins and we have dresses. So we want a dress which fits the mannequin the best. Likewise, we want a statistical model which fits the data best. So how to identify the model and how to choose a model is what we're going to cover in the next few minutes. So when you select the model of an LCA, you need to do something called identify the maximum likelihood solution for each model. That means how likely is that model going to explain your data? And you must evaluate the fit of the model to see how well it fits your data. And you have to select the most plausible model. So for example, here you have a data set. And I have designed a model. And my model has given me some parameters. So based on my model, I have got a class prevalence and I have got an item response parameter. Now, likelihood function tells me, based on my model, how well it actually captures your data. So maximum likelihood estimate, it tells you which parameter value explains the data the best. Okay, so I'll give an example. Suppose you toss a coin and you get heads. I've tossed a coin 10 times and 7 times I've gotten the head. What is the probability of me getting a head when I toss a coin? Sorry? It can be 50%, right? 0.5. Can it be 0.6? It can be. Why? Here I have tossed a coin 10 times and I got only 7 times head. So the probability can be 7, 0.7, 70%. The probability can be 30%, 40%, 50%. Anything can be the probability. But which value of P explains this observation? Seven. Only if I say my probability is 0.7, is it going to explain my data? So even though there are so many probabilities available, I can have a probability of 50%, 30%, 70%, 80%. In this scenario, my data, 7 heads out of 10 times. The P value is going to be 7. That's the maximum likelihood estimate. Suppose I threw the coin 10 times and I got 6 times head. Which P value will explain my finding? P value of 0.6. So that is exactly what maximum likelihood ratio is. That it will change based on the data that you provide the model. So how to estimate this maximum likelihood? We use an iterative approach called expectation maximization algorithm. Because LCA is such a complex model, we can't use straightforward equations. We'll have to use an iterative model. It has E steps and M steps. So when you start up this model, you have no idea. You just give a random guess. You tell, okay, maybe 50% belong to class A, 50% belong to class B. Then the model will run. It will give you some probabilities. And based on the probabilities, it will give you some class parameters. And then it will run a second time with different values till there can be no difference in your model. So I'll just give an example. When you first start off, you have an unknown distribution. So you start off with a guess. You tell me, okay, I'm going to assume there are 2 classes. This class, this is the parameter for this class. And for the second class, this is the parameter. Then the model will run one time. Then the next time you give it new parameters. And each time it keeps running, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, till 10 times, following which every time you keep running the model, you're going to have the same response. That is called convergence. So you guess the missing class, you update the model, and you repeat until it is stable. So what is this E step, expectation? So given the current model, you have to give this data. What is the probability? So for example, I will tell, I think patient A, 70% probability that he belongs to high risk and 30% probability that he belongs to low risk. For patient B, I think he has a 20% probability of belonging to high risk. So then the model will run the E step. Then the model will give me M step. That is, based on the probabilities that you have provided, what is the proportion of the class? What is the item response probability? And this keeps on repeating. You give new parameters, it will generate new probabilities. So you keep going back and forth from E to M step till there is convergence. That means the likelihood stops improving and the changes that you get are very small. Okay. So our goal is to actually get a positive likelihood ratio. So if you see in iteration 1, your log likelihood was -4. But in iteration 3, your log likelihood became more positive. So you must choose the third model where you have the most positive log likelihood ratio. Okay. So how do you find the maximum likelihood solution? So how do you actually generate this parameter? So many algorithms require initial value for the entire iterative procedure to kickstart. And the initial value determines where the algorithm will start its search and how fast the algorithm will give you the answer. So based on the parameters that you give, your model you can either identify a model, or you will under-identify a model, or you can unidentify a model. I'll explain to you. So far, did everybody understand what is a parameter? Because I've been using the word parameter. Do you understand what is a parameter? So parameters are just numbers. Okay, so the two parameters are class membership. For example, 40% belong to class 1, 35 belong to class 2, 25% belong to class 3. And the other parameters are your item response probability. That means based on class 1, what is the probability that you're going to say yes to fever? So these individual numbers are actually the parameters. Okay. So each of the parameters have their own likelihood function. So for a particular parameter, this is a unimodal likelihood function. You have likelihood on the y-axis. To identify a model, you must reach the summit of this graph. This point gives you the maximum likelihood that your model is going to explain the data. Okay, so our entire process of running that E and M step is to identify the topmost part of the peak. Now let's look at an example. A helicopter comes, it drops a blindfolded person on the bottom of the mountain. This man has to climb the top of the hill to reach the peak. Is it possible to do it blindfolded? That's exactly what we're doing. We have no idea what's happening. We're blindfolding ourselves and we're running these models. So is it possible for him to reach the top of the mountain? Yes. He just has to keep going one step at a time, and slowly, inevitably, he will reach the highest point. Suppose a helicopter dropped me somewhere closer towards the truth. That person will reach faster towards the model, to the peak. So here, you can identify a model, but based on the starting parameters, you might take long time or you can take a short time to identify the model. Now suppose look at this particular graph. Okay, this is a multimodal likelihood function. So here, if I'm dropped in this part of the mountain, I can easily reach the top of the mountain. Suppose I was dropped in this part, will I be able to find the true answer? No, because when I'm blindfolded, I would have reached the top of this hill and I will think that this is the true model when the true model is actually here. So it's very important that we don't get stuck in local maximas. So if I identify this as my likelihood estimate, then I'm actually under-identifying a model. That is why when you start this iterative procedures, we don't know what the function looks like. So you must give lot of assumptions. You must give actually at least 50 assumptions so that you start off with different points on this graph. So finally, all of you will reach the top of the peak. Now, what about this? Here, what happens is the man is in the top of the mountain, but there is no particular point, there's no particular value of the parameter which gives you the maximum likelihood. So here you will not be able to identify a particular model which explains your data the best. So I gave you 3 scenarios where it's easy to identify a model, very difficult to identify a model. In actual reality, you will have a huge infinite combinations lying in between. And the other thing to understand is all these graphs I've given you are all based on only a single parameter. But in reality, we're calculating so many parameters. So we'll have a lot of difficulty in identifying models. And the key condition for identification is your known data should be much more than your unknown data. And in latent class analysis, we're actually looking at the unknown information, which corresponds to all these parameters. So the more the parameters you have, the more difficult it is to actually identify a model. Now, what are some features of data set which provides more information? If you have a larger sample size, you will have more information. If you have something called the N by W, N means sample size divided by the number of cells in a contingency table. If this is a larger value, you have more information. For example, if I have 3 variables, my cells in the contingency table will be 8. If I have 10 variables, it will be 1024. If I have 1024 squares and I have only 100 patients, each square will have very sparse population. So that will give you a very poor data. So what you need to do is you need to reduce the number of patterns and have more patients occupying each response pattern. The next thing is to look at the strength of the relation between the observed and latent variable. And that you get by looking at the item response probability, which is characterized by homogeneity and latent class separation. Okay. So suppose you model 3 symptoms, fever, cough, and fatigue. And the model gives you 2 outputs. One is class 1 and class 2. And it gives you item response probabilities for each of these classes. So how many parameters are there in this particular model? Okay, so you have 1 parameter here. And these 2 are, if you have 0.6, obviously the other one is 0.35. So this is 1 parameter. Then you have here is 1 parameter. Here is another parameter. If this is 0.85, this will obviously become 0.15. So you must take only parameter 1, parameter 2, parameter 3, parameter 4, parameter 5, parameter 6, and you have parameter 7. So for this particular example, there are 7 parameters. Now I'll just give an example on how you start off the iteration. So for run 1, I will tell the probability of fever is 0.5. For run 2, I will say the probability of fever is 0.8. And for run 3, I will tell the probability of fever is 0.2. Now I'll assess for convergence. So run 1 gave me a probability of fever of class 1 fever as 0.9. Run 2 gave me the class 1 fever was 0.6. Are these 2 matching? They're not matching. So this is called non-convergence. So I need to redo the entire loop. I need to keep doing the loop till I get a convergence. Suppose I've done this loop so many times and I still don't get a convergence. I still don't find an ML solution. What do I do? One is I can reduce the parameters by fixing the parameters. Second is I reduce a class. I will just make an assumption there are no 2 classes, there's just 1 class. And third thing is I can actually drop off a variable from the contingency table. Now each of it has its own advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, so right now I told you about how to develop models. Now the next question is, how do you select a model? So to select a model, we look at some statistical tests. We look at a concept called parsimony, and we also see whether this model is clinically interpretable or not. Now absolute fit is, for a particular model, how well does this model fit your data? So for that, you have a null hypothesis. What you're saying is the true population that the model has produced actually represents the observed data. And we want to find a model which does not reject the null hypothesis. And one statistic that you look to assess this is the likelihood ratio statistic, or the G square. And we want a low G square. The next step is, among 2 models, which of these models fit the data better? That is called optimal balance of fit for a particular data. So for that, you can use 2 statistical criteria. You have the likelihood ratio difference test, and you also have the information criteria. So under information criteria, you have 2 criteria. One is called the Akaike information criteria, and one is the Bayesian information criteria. Usually LCA models, they use these 2 criterion to decide among 2 models which are the better models. So I'll give you a question. Which dress would you choose when both are fitting well? One looks more frilly and one looks more plain. So the answer to that is by applying a philosophical concept called parsimony. That means you must choose the simpler model. So when you have two models which give you good data, you must always choose a model which has fewer parameters and fewer classes. Okay. So next thing is, how do you actually fit the model? Okay, so you have something called the information criteria, which I just told you, right? Bayesian information criteria and Akaike information criteria. So these are called penalized fit statistics. So G square basically tells you the likelihood function. And now you have to penalize the models for their elaborateness. So for IKK information model, it will penalize for the number of parameters. Bayesian information criteria will penalize not only for the parameters, it also penalizes for the sample size. Okay. And the last step is the cross validation. That means you have to determine whether your model can be generalizable to other data sets. So one way where you can do it, you split the entire data set into two categories. One is the training model and the validation model. You run your model on the training set and see whether it works on the validation set. The other is something called k-fold cross validation, where you divide your model into k number of classes. You train k minus one number of classes, and then you check on the valid data set. And you keep repeating this process for all the k sets. Okay, just to give you an understanding of what I've just explained. Here you have a LCA output for indicators of positive health behavior. Basically, they've asked some teenagers whether they eat breakfast, whether they eat green vegetables, whether they eat fruits, whether they exercise, and whether they get 7 hours of sleep. Okay, and they have got some response proportion. And when they ran the model, okay, so these are the various model outputs. So model number 1 had only one latent class. It gives you the G square value, it gives you the AIC value and the BIC value, and gives the likelihood function. So how do you choose which of these models best explain the observation data? The first step is to look at the G square. Lower G square means better the model. So which of these have the lowest G square? 5. The next thing is to look at the AIC. We want a low AIC. Which of these have the lowest AIC? 5. Looking at the BIC, which has the lowest BIC? 4th class. And if you look at the likelihood ratio, which has the most positive likelihood ratio? Class number 5. So based on this, the authors have taken 5 number of classes to actually describe this data. So if you look at it, this entire data set, they have divided them into 5 classes, labeled them as unhealthy, sleep deprived, typical, healthy eaters, and healthy population. Now look at another data set. This is to look at delinquent behaviors. They have some questionnaires: lied to parents, publicly loud, rowdy, unruly, they've damaged property, taken part in a group fight. Now, how to divide this data? So they've designed some models and they have gotten 4 classes. Using 5 and 6 class, they could not find convergence in the model. So you automatically discard class number 5 and class number 6. Now, among the 4 models with which they got convergence, which is the best model? Let's look at G square. Which has the lowest G square? Class number 4. And here, because the degrees of freedom is very less, you can look at the p-value. And 0.58 actually rejects the null hypothesis. And if you look at it, the AIC and BIC also are the lowest. So here they have classified the data into 4 clusters: mild delinquents, verbal antagonists, shoplifters, and general delinquents. So this I've just given you an example of how to use the statistics to fit the model to your data. The last part of the technical aspect of LCA is how to handle missing data. One thing is you just discard all the variables where you don't have any data. But the problem is you'll come up with a very small sample size. The second option is to do something called full information maximum likelihood. That means whether you have whether there are missing variables or not, you combine everybody into your model, which is actually preferred for LCA. The third option is to give multiple imputations. That means each hidden variable you impute some number. But the problem is you're going to end up with a lot of data sets and it's going to be very difficult to compute. So the best model is actually to do the full information maximum likelihood. So I've given you a broad overview of LCA. I've not gone too much into the technical aspects. I've not given any of the equations. So with this flavor, how do you actually apply LCA in terms of medicine? One is to identify disease phenotypes. So in medicine, we have so many syndromic clinical conditions. They all have broad definitions. But you know that even though I diagnose a patient with ARDS, that patient is very different from another patient who you also diagnose with ARDS. So they have used LCA in ARDS, sepsis, asthma, in this example, disorders of brain-gut interaction. And they're trying to find hidden groups among them so that your treatment can vary. You can individualize the treatment for these patients. Some other uses of LCA is to identify disease phenotypes, symptoms clustering, to predict treatment response, and especially in psychology in risk behavior clustering. And you can also use LCA for diagnostic classification. For example, when you don't have a gold standard test, you can use LCA to actually assess new diagnostic tools by assuming there is a true unobserved disease status. A very good example, I mean, a very good article on how to actually do LCA for a clinical perspective is actually by Dr. Pratik Sinha. And I've actually used some of his tables to actually critically appraise our study. And he has also published an LCA on ARDS subphenotypes, which is very nicely written. So if you look at his article, the first step is to generate a hypothesis. Next thing is how to set up the data and how to estimate the model and how to evaluate the model and how to interpret the optimal model. And when you critically appraise a study using LCA, you must answer these questions. Whether the researchers have identified a good question, how they have selected the variables, what was the sample size in the study, and how have they managed the data, what model have they selected, and how have they interpreted the findings. So to critically appraise the study, I'm going to use the CAS checklist. Okay. So this study, did the study address a clearly focused issue? So yes, the objective of this study was actually to define distinct phenotypic subgroups, latent classes, in patients with bloating and distension, based on clinical variables like dietary habit, physical activity, psychosocial well-being, and comorbid conditions. So if you look at the PICO statement, the populations were adults with bloating and distension. The exposure was multidimensional. It could be the diet, the psychosocial aspect, the GI disease. And the outcome is basically making latent phenotype clusters. And what is the study design? They used a cross-sectional study using LCA model. So did the authors use an appropriate method? So I said yes, because LCA design is appropriate for phenotyping as well as for hypothesis generation. The next question, were the subjects recruited in an acceptable way? So I have given no because I feel there is a moderate risk of selection bias. So how did they do the study? It was actually a secondary analysis from a large multinational survey. So this was the original article. So what they have done is they wanted to study and get data on many countries so that they can basically estimate the regional and local estimates of functional GI disturbance prevalence. And they also want to develop a database that could serve as a source of data mining. Okay, so this study was conducted over 33 countries, 6 continents, and all the countries which is shaded in blue, they have collected the data by internet survey. All the countries where they have gone by person is shaded in yellow, and where they have gone in person and used the internet is shaded in green. And what they have found out was, using internet surveys, they have found the prevalence to be 40%. Using household surveys, they have found the prevalence to be 20%. And what they did is 2,000 individuals were surveyed in each country, and they have used quota-based sampling. So before they recruited the patients, they wanted a predefined demographic parameters. For example, they wanted exactly 50% female and 50% male from each country. They wanted 40% of the patients to be less than 40 years, 40% to be within 40 to 65 years, and 20% to be more than 65 years. So they wanted an age, like a specific age categories. And they also wanted that there should be less than 30% of patients with a university level education. So this was the original study. And for our study, they have taken the data from 3 countries, that is US, UK, and Mexico. And the data for all these 3 countries were actually obtained by using an internet survey. So if you look at some of the questionnaires, they have asked questions on demography. They've asked questions about the socioeconomic well-being. They've also asked the diet as well as the quality of life indicators. So if you look at the source, it's a general population. These are not patients who have come to the hospital. But the problem is they have been pre-selected and invited. And how do they recruit the patients? They had a professional company called Qualtrics which would actually award participant points with redeemable gifts. And the sampling is also not random sampling, it's a quota-based sampling. So they had pre-specified quotas for age, gender, education levels. So because it's an internet user survey, there is a definite selection bias. Because patients who don't have access to the internet, patients who are less health illiterate, patients from a lower socioeconomic group, and even elderly might not really be able to take part in your survey. And how do they include the participants for this particular study is, there was a question in the original survey. In the past 3 months, how frequently did you experience bloating or that your stomach appeared abnormally large? If you answered any answer except never, you were included in the current study. So the next question is whether measures accurately measure to reduce bias. So here I would say no, because it's a self-reported data. There is an inherent recall bias in all self-reported data. Second thing is there's no clinical verification of your data. There was no physician who actually cross-checked your symptoms. And all these are subjective variables, so they're all perception-based. So there's definitely some bias. The next question is, was the data collected in a way that addressed the research issue? So I said yes. So if you look at the questionnaire, it was an electronic design. They had 4 GI symptom questions. They had validated questionnaires to assess multiple domains. And they've taken about 42 variables. And they've used the same question for US, UK, Mexico. And the study questionnaire, it underwent translatability to see how well it can be applied to the population. And they've also translated by the same company for Mexicans. And they ensured that there was cultural acceptability. And they had a rigorous data quality check. So some of the questions, the 4 main GI questions they had asked is, which of the following best describes your typical experience when you felt bloated or when you had distension in the past 3 months? You only had a sensation of bloating, or you had bloating and distension, or you had only distension. And suppose you had bloating or distension, how often did it happen immediately after eating or drinking? So they could give the responses as follows. And then when you had bloating, what was the relation to the amount of food you drank? Did it happen if you took small amounts of food or normal sized meals or with large amount of food? And the next thing is when you felt bloated or you felt distended, which one started first? Did the bloating start first, or did the distension start first, or did both start first? Then they've also used a lot of validated questionnaires. They used the Rome-4 questionnaire to diagnose functional GI disorders. They have used the intestinal gas questionnaire to assess the GI symptoms within the past 24 hours. They have used something called the patient health questionnaire somatization to look for actually somatic disorders. They've also looked at the dietary aspect of the patients. They've looked at the PROMIS Global Health Questionnaire, and they've also asked questions on demographics, medication, supplements, healthcare use, exercise, and life stress. And to ensure that the data is extremely good, they've gone to great extents. So all the fields are made mandatory. So if a patient did not miss, like if they missed a particular question, they were excluded from the data set. And they had 2 attention check items to make sure that the respondents were not inattentive when they did the questionnaire. And third thing is they also looked at the time taken for the patient to finish the questionnaire. If they finished the questionnaire too fast, they were discarded from the study. And they had also repeated the questionnaires to make sure that the responses were consistent. So did the study have enough participants to minimize the play of chance? So yes. So the sample size, one thing is they didn't have a priori sample size justification, but they had enough and more sample size to actually do a latent class analysis. If you look at the literature, you need at least 500 participants. Here they had about 3,471 participants. The next question is, how were the results presented and what is the main result? So if you look at the final output of the study, among all the bloaters and abdominal distenders, you have totally 6 latent classes. Okay, and I will come to what these latent classes are. And if you look at the demographic data, among the US, UK, and the Mexicans, most of them were females. 56% of the population were actually females who reported abdominal distension and bloating. And Mexicans had the highest prevalence of abdominal distension and bloating with 75.1%. Yeah, so among the primary cohort who had actually reported abdominal distension and bloating, 43 of them was the mean age and 57% were women. Among the main cohort who did not report abdominal distension and bloating, 52 was the mean age and 39.7 were women. So what it means is bloating and abdominal distension seems to be more common in a younger population and more in females. So this I'll skip. These are basically the first 4 questions. We'll just concentrate on the latent class output. So they had used about 42 variables. And one thing to understand is, if you look at the health-related quality of life measures, for global health, for the promised global physical health, a higher value meant the patient's doing better. But for all the other scores, that is global mental health, depression, anxiety, a higher value means the patient did really badly. So based on this, they have generated 6 clusters. So this is the first cluster, bloating and distension with limited impairment of quality of life indicators. So here is a radial plot. Okay, so for this first symptom, here you can see is the bloating and distension. Okay, so what you can see here is these patients actually complained of abdominal pressure, increased abdominal girth, passing gas within the past 24 hours. So they had significant GI symptoms. Whatever values which are falling above the bold circle means as a positive correlation. Whatever is falling within the bold circle means as a negative correlation. And what you can see here is, if you look at the promised global mental health, they have a very high value. That means they're doing well. Okay, so the same data I'll show in the heat plot. So if you see here, whatever is very dark shade means as a high correlation. Whatever is light shade means it's the opposite. So for this particular domain, bloating and distension, which seems to be more darker, just distension, bloating and distension, or bloating? Bloating and distension seems to be darker. So this group had both bloating and distension. Now, what about the GI symptoms? This is the intestinal gas questionnaire. Within the past 24 hours of doing the questionnaire, how many of them had a lot of GI symptoms? It seems to be quite dark. So they had significant GI symptoms. And here, if you see, they also report some triggers with their food. Okay. And look at the health-related quality of life. The mental health seems to be excellent. Depression and anxiety seems to be not so much. So this cluster basically has quite a lot of symptoms. They have dietary triggers, but overall their mental health seems to be very good. Now let's look at the next cluster. So you have bloating with or without distension. This is the bloating part. But they have moderate impairment of the quality of life indicators. So if you look at this, their anxiety score seems to be quite high. And they don't seem to have any correlation with their dietary triggers. So let's look at it in the heat map. So they have bloating, that seems to be the darkest. If you compare to the cluster 1, their GI symptoms seems to be so trivial, no? They don't have severe GI symptoms. What about their mental health? It's the exact opposite. They're depressed, they're anxious, they have high stress scores, and their overall functioning is very poor. And what about the diet? There does not seem to be much dietary triggered with this cluster. Then the next cluster is basically distension predominance. Here you can see distension seems to be the maximum symptom. There is no dietary association, and these patients also seem to be having a good global health. So here distension is the maximum shading. And compared to the first cluster, they have absolutely no GI symptoms. And they have very good quality of life. And they don't have much of a dietary trigger also. So these seem to be the people who are actually doing the best. Then you have the next cluster. So here again, you have bloating predominance. Here, can you see? They're all reporting a dietary association, especially with beans, peas, and lentils consumption. And here, even though they have a lot of triggers, they seem to be good mentally, and they have less anxiety scores. So let's look at it. So they have bloating, and they have triggers. Here you can see this is the one for beans, peas, and lentils. And they don't have much of GI symptoms at all, and they have very good mental health. Now, the fifth cluster is basically, these are patients who actually have a functional GI disorder. So they have either IBS, constipation, or they have IBS mixed. They have constipation and diarrhea. And just look at them. They have significant amount of GI symptoms, and they have lot of psychosocial stress because of these symptoms. And they also have a lot of dietary correlation. So they are strongly positive for all your Rome disorders, especially IBS constipation and IBS mixed. And you can look at the physical health is really poor. They have a lot of depression, anxiety. They have very poor health. And they have a lot of dietary triggers also. And worst of all, they have significant amount of GI symptoms. And you can also see that they're using a lot of fibers and probiotics, probably for symptom alleviation. Then the last cluster they have identified is IBS-D. So here is IBS diarrhea. That seems to be the most common. They also have significant amount of 24-hour GI symptoms. They don't have any correlation with their diet. And they have extremely poor mental health. They're extremely anxious and they're depressed. So here diarrhea is the most predominant symptom. And compared to this, they're mentally doing very badly. And they also have significant amount of GI symptoms. And if you look at something, this is a cluster with the least amount of exercise. So they're quite sedentary amount of people and they have a lot of psychosocial stress. So they have given tables individually for each variable. So we'll skip these. And so finally, I've just put all the clusters together. So we have cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, cluster 4, cluster 5. The article doesn't give you the cluster sizes in a table. So I have just made the table. So you can see that the distension predominant with no reporting of dietary association was the maximum cluster. And interesting thing is, all of them are on the younger side and most of them are all females. So now the next question is, was the data analysis sufficiently rigorous? So this is where I'll be actually appraising the LCA part in the study. Okay, so let's look at it. The research question. So they had a good research question. This was a good model to run the research question. Next thing is variable selection. And so we'll be covering all these in the next table. So first thing is indicator selection. Have they presented a clear rationale for indicator selection? So they wanted to elucidate the interplay of dietary habits, physical activity, psychosocial well-being. And so this is appropriate. Next thing is, have they described the procedures used for data transformation? So for example, some of these data was actually continuous. You must make sure that your continuous variables are actually following the bell-shaped curve. If they're not, you must adjust. So here they're not reported anything about how they collected the variables, if they do any data adjustment. Next thing is local independence. That means, are these variables independent? Is there any collinearity? Here in this study, in the statistics part, they have not reported collinearity or correlation coefficient. So we don't know about the local independence assumption. Next thing is sample size. So they've told sample size is more than 500, but they have not mentioned any rationale for the sample size. That's because it was a descriptive study and they did not have any a priori hypothesis. The next thing is, how do they handle missing data? So this study was really good because they never had missing data. Anybody who had missing data, they had excluded. So the statistics of this study is like I've divided it. They have told that they have done the LCA in the depth mix package in R. They have used 42 variables. The model selection, they had some 2 to 7 models. And they have used a BIC to choose the best model. And they felt that the 6 clusters was the best fit. The next thing is, they've told the subjects were grouped into clusters based on the predicted class membership. They've calculated the Z scores. And they've plotted heat map and radar plots. And then they've done the cluster analysis. But they have not mentioned the other fit indices. They mentioned only BIC. They've not talked about any of the other indices. They've not presented the fit statistics and they've not talked about entropy. So that is a big lacuna, I think, in the reporting of this study. There's only one graph which tells you the BIC value for 6 clusters. Then the last step is interpreting the final model. So they've not mentioned how they have reached the maximum likelihood ratio. They've not mentioned the posterior probability of the classes. And third thing is, they have not mentioned an a priori hypothesis plan for interpretation of the result. I just want to just show another slide of another article by Dr. Pratik Sinha, who has also used LCA for an ARDS subphenotype. I just wanted to show how he has reported his findings. So he has mentioned that continuous variables they have standardized. They have assumed that missing data were missing at random, and they have included all for analysis. So they have used a FIML model for handling missing data. He has mentioned that the data were data that were highly collinear were excluded from the model. He has used a correlation matrix to test the correlation, and all the correlation coefficients was less than 0.5. He has also told how they have calculated the maximum likelihood by using 500 random starts, and they have taken the best 50. And in their LCA, they have used the Bayesian information criteria. And they've also used another fit test called the VLMR test. which looks at K class versus K minus 1 class for the model fit. And he has also mentioned the entropy to measure class separation. And they have given the fit statistics in their study. So they have looked at the number of classes, the BIC, the entropy. I told that the higher the entropy, the better the model. And the number of patients assigned to each class and the p-values. And he has also given the posterior probabilities for each of the subphenotypes in their study. So I thought that was something which was missing in the study because they have not gone into the details of the statistical part. The next question is there a clear statement of findings? So yes, they have identified 6 clusters and all the clusters are differing by diet triggers, the IBS subtype, the psychosocial burden, and the quality of life. So they actually align with known psychosocial models of this disease and also with the IBS heterogeneity literature. So it's consistent with existing knowledge and clinically meaningful findings are there. Can the results be applied to the local population? They have done the study in US, UK, and Mexico, which is definitely different from the dietary triggers in our Indian population and the SES background of our population. So how valuable is this research? So this is valuable in terms, it's a hypothesis generating research. It has potential because you can probably design personalized treatment strategies like diet-based, psychosocial, or gut targeted, but you cannot, they have not looked at any outcome parameters, so we don't really know. So now coming back to our case scenarios, after this extensive talk, how will you treat each of these patients? So instead of giving Pantop and Simethicone, you should actually spend extra few minutes talking to the patients and getting some important pertinent history. For this 32-year-old school teacher who appeared very anxious and on probing, I found that she was very stressed. I would have sent her to the psychiatry for stress management and cognitive behavior therapy. And I will, later on, she was subsequently started on low-dose amitriptyline. The second patient, who was a banker who had severe bloating daily, worse by evening, and he passed stools only once in 3 to 4 days. So he actually comes under the IBS-C spectrum, the constipation spectrum. So for him, you would probably give Naturalax powder, polyethylene glycol, and you will tell him to gradually increase the fiber content to up to 20 grams per day, daily exercise, plenty of water intake. And if he's not showing improvement, you can probably start him on prucalopride, 2 grams, 2 mg. And for your IT professional who had significant dietary triggers, for him, you will start him on low FODMAP diet trial, and you'll ask him to maintain a food diary, and you will give him a dietitian referral. So the conclusion is all bloaters and distenders are not the same. Thank you. And actually, incidentally, the World IBS Day is falling in the next week. So we have commemorated by looking beyond gas, and we have understood hidden patterns in bloating. We looked at the clinical and the latent class perspective. Thank you.